extreme radical elements has not as yet ceased. The security forces will do its utmost to ensure that the killing of black citizens by other blacks is stopped. As we have reported before, many potential necklace victims have already been saved by the security forces. Before I introduce my colleagues, Dr. Neitland and Mr. Ventner, to you again, I would be happy to answer any questions on this briefing. Mr. Devenish, with pleasure. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, you have met Dr. Neitland and Mr. Ventner last week. Dr. Neitland, Dr. Gorbius Neitland, is Director of the Bureau's Research Unit, and Mr. David Ventner is Deputy Director. They will now give an overview of the events of the past 3 weeks. Because of numerous inquiries regarding their history and past achievements, I am in Cape Town, a D.Ed at the University of Potchefstroom. His previous position was that of Superintendent of Education, specializing in creativity training at the Cape Education Department. He is mentioned in the following publications: The Who's Who of Intellectuals, International Authors and Writers Who's Who, International Men of Prose, 1986. One of only 1,000 nominations worldwide. He's also mentioned in Research Board of Advisors, the American Biographical Institute. He had received the following scholarships: International Scholarship for Study and Research on Curriculum Design. He was, amongst others, also an overseas correspondent for SABC, a planner, co-planner and author of television scripts, a planner and presenter of numerous radio programs. He has published 47 books, 4 television scripts, 15 articles. And to top all of that, he plays rugby and cricket and has played rugby on provincial level. Mr. David Ventner is the Deputy Director of Research at the Bureau.
There will be a handout on my introduction this afternoon, but unfortunately our computer packed up yesterday and we were not able to process the material, the graphs, etc. We would have liked to have handed out to you next time. A few years ago, my professor at the University of Georgia, and also my most important mentor, addressed a group of people from the press and made 2 comments which I still remember very vividly. He said that when addressing people from media, you should realize that 40% of them will always be honest, 40% will always be dishonest, and the other 20% should always be watched. The second comment was more serious, and he said we should encourage respect for the rules along with the development of skills for using the freedoms allowed under the rules. This afternoon we will again give you an overview of the unrest situation like we did last week. We realize very clearly that statistics, graphs, diagrams do not tell the full story, and that the psychological climate, the emotions, the attitudes, the aspirations of people are not always represented in statistics of this nature. We do realize this. But I repeat what I said last week, and that is that we are endeavoring in close cooperation with other departments and institutes to assess these other aspects which are of vital importance to everyone in this country. If we look at the number of incidents the past week, we note that it is down on last week's figure. This trend seems to indicate that there has been greater control and stability throughout the country the past 2 weeks than, for instance, the first week of the emergency situation, or for that matter, to what the situation had been in April and May of this year. Compared to April, the number of incidents has decreased by 61%, and compared to May, the decrease has been 65%. I'd like to repeat that sentence. Compared to April, the number of incidents the past 2 weeks has decreased by 61%, and compared to May, the decrease has been 65%. 5%. There has been an increase in the number of deaths the past week compared to last week, an average of 4.3 per day compared to an average of 2 last week. But I would like to add that on 2 days the past week, no deaths were reported. The first week of the emergency situation, you will remember, the average was 7.3 per day. In May, for instance, the average was 5.1 per day. Important to note here is that 64% of unrest-related deaths which occurred in April and 73% in May were as a result of black-on-black violence. During the past 3 weeks, black-on-black violence accounted for 67% of the total number of deaths. Very briefly then, before Mr. Ventner elaborates on some of the detail, it does seem, in short-term perspective, that there is more countrywide stability than what has been the case the past few months. But we realize, as researchers, we cannot but realize that it is only in the long term that accurate assessment of this nature can be made. I would now like to repeat one or two of the paragraphs in Afrikaans. Op hierdie stap en dat op hierdie tydstip die noodtoestand beslis positiewe resultate oplewer. Verder wil ek toevoeg dat in April swart op swart geweld verantwoordelik was vir 67% van die sterftes as gevolg van swart op swart geweld was.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would just like to reiterate what my colleague, Dr. Neitland, has said, so that there will be no doubt as far as this is concerned, lives and injuries to simple statistics. However, it is impossible to do any meaningful research without looking at a situation from an...
Dr. Neitland has explained to you the number of incidents has dropped slightly from the second week. You will remember that there was a fairly big drop from week 1 to week 2. In week 1, from week 1 to week 2, there was a drop of 64%. From week 2 to week 3, there is a drop of 1.7%. A drop of 5.3%. Apology. A drop of 5.3%. I would like to break this down for you. Stone throwing, once again, as in the previous 2 weeks, accounted for over 30% of the incidents. In fact, 31.7% of the incidents were stone throwing incidents. Arson accounted for approximately 16% of the incidents in the past week. Petrol bombings for 15.6% of the incidents. If we compare that to the first week, it was 23% in the first week, and in the second week it was 17.5%. Then illegal gatherings, 6.2%, which is more or less what it was in the first 2 weeks. Then murder, 6.6%, and robbery, 6.2%. All the other incidents were relatively minor incidents and did not contribute much to the total picture. So therefore, just to summarize that, we have a drop of 5.3% from week 2 to week 3. Then, ladies and gentlemen, if we view the picture as far as those injured is concerned, there was a relatively large increase from week 2 to week 3 in terms of the numbers injured. I must, however, point out that after Chief Minister Buthelezi spoke in Soweto, you will remember that there was a fairly big accident involving a number of buses and a minibus and quite a number of people were injured in that particular incident, and therefore this has changed the picture rather dramatically. We find that the average number of injured for the past week is 10,4, which is an increase of 5,7 over the previous week. 10,4 giving an increase of 5,7 over the previous week. Then we will look at those killed. Here again, the number killed is substantially higher than in the second week. In the second week, we had an average of 2 killed per day. This is up to 4,3. 4,3, so we have an increase of 2,3. Once again, I must point out here that the period over the weekend seemed to be a period where a relatively high number of people were killed. If I break this down, which may interest you, in the past week, the security forces, the South African police, was responsible for approximately 17% of the deaths. Municipal police for 3,3% of the deaths. Development board officials for 6,7%. People who inflicted death upon themselves, 3,3%. Black upon black violence, 66,7%. And then also members of the force, 3,3%. Then we move on to the picture as far as attacks on the security forces is concerned. You will remember that there again, there was a considerable drop from the first to the second week. We, however, find that there has again been somewhat of an increase. The average per day in the third week, 4,4, which is an increase of 1,4 attacks per day on the security forces. That in a percentage would give you an approximate 33% increase. The nature of these attacks was more or less once again stone throwing incidents, making up by far the greatest percentage, namely 58%, and petrol bombings 16%. A substantial improvement in terms of damage, and we do not mention specific figures in this regard, from week 1 to week 2. From week 2 to week 3, there's however been an increase again, an increase in the order of about 50%. And here I must point out that when one looks at the damage picture, it is often a case of a number of very expensive delivery vehicles that have been set alight. This, in fact, would be the main contributing factor to the damage picture. If we look at the breakdown per police division, I would like to give you the picture in terms of an increase or a decrease per division. In Soweto, there was an increase in unrest incidents of 6.25%. On the West Rand, there was a decrease of 16.7%. On the East Rand, 10.7%. In the Western Transvaal, 75%. In the Eastern Transvaal, a decrease of 50%. In the Northern Transvaal, a decrease of 11.1%. In the far Northern Transvaal, a decrease of 100%. In the Transvaal, there was a decrease of 57.1%. Northern Cape, an increase of 200%. The Eastern Province, an increase of 6.8%. Border, a decrease of 60%. Southwestern Districts, an increase of 50%. the Boland, a decrease of 50%, the Western Province, an increase of 22.2%, the Orange Free State, an increase of 200%, the Northern Orange 50%, and the Witwatersrand, a decrease of 100%. If we look at the breakdown for the past week in terms of the different divisions, then by far the greatest percentage of unrest incidents was in Soweto, 24.2%. Second to Soweto was the Eastern Cape. Those then would be the 4 main unrest areas. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I would like to reiterate what Dr. Neitland has said, that one cannot draw firm conclusions from statistics over a period of 3 weeks. We simply have vague indications which must still develop into strong tendencies. Thank you very much.
Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you about the Neitland. First, it was compared to April, the number of incidents in the past 2 weeks increased by 6%.
I beg pardon, could you please switch on the microphone that we could hear you better? Thank you.
Yeah, he said compared to April, the number of incidents in the past 2 weeks has decreased.
Could you just repeat for me, please, Mr. Ventner? I got a bit lost. The percentage differences up and down, and there was some I wasn't clear on whether they...
Forces were responsible for 21.3% of the deaths, and black upon black violence for 78.7% of the deaths. In the third week, the security forces were responsible for, now you must allow me a few seconds, about 35% of the deaths, whereas black upon black violence was in the region of 65% of the deaths. I can give that to you more accurately later if you wish. Figures are available, and I think that you could have calculated them from the situation reports that are given to you daily. As far as I have them at the moment, my totals add up to, and please bear in mind that my totals are only up to 0600 hours on the 3rd of July. Up to that point, I have a total of 95 deaths. 0600 hours, 3rd of July, 95 deaths. I must also point out that whenever a new death comes up in the statistics, we try to include it immediately or in the following set of statistics. But we try our very best to include it where it should be under the particular date.
Into trouble later on when it does subsequently appear that this death was not unrest related, but in fact murder, just normal murder. Murder is never normal, but not politically motivated incident.
Could I follow up with
In the second week, Kwandebele was 8.1% of the total incidents, and in the third week it was 9% of the total incidents. And in the first week, Kwandebele made out 6.5% of the total incidents. So clearly, Kwandebele remains a difficult spot.